Does happiness require unhappiness? If some people regret having children, does that justify abortion? And does the US need to step in to defend Taiwan? We answer these questions and more on this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of Good Take, Bad Take. This is the show where we go through the internet and find the most interesting takes, and we try to take them apart, break them down, highlight the good and the bad. My name is Donald, and I'm here with my co-host Britt. Before we get started, just a reminder to give us a like, share, comment, all that stuff that helps us out in the algorithm. It's great, and we appreciate it deeply. You can follow us at Good Take, Bad Take Pod on Instagram and Good Bad Take Pod on YouTube and Twitter. Without further ado, let's get started. The first take comes from Arthur Brooks, who tweets, "Your happiness requires unhappiness. That means both the fun parts I want and the hard parts I need, so that I stay alert, mourn loss, learn, and grow. Some days, giving thanks for the bad feelings is just too hard. But we can at least remember that they exist for a reason. They are normal, we are normal, and we're all right for feeling them." What do you take, or what is your take on this assessment of happiness?
I think it's good. I guess I would have preferred if he'd expanded upon, but given that it's a tweet or I guess a post now on X, I guess you are somewhat limited. But his first line is really good. That happiness sometimes requires unhappiness. I guess he doesn't have the sometimes in there, but that's what I would add to it. Particularly that, if you don't plan ahead, if you don't think through, a plan to be happy, if you don't make the appropriate sacrifices, even when you get things that are awesome, you don't feel like you've earned them. There's something subconsciously that isn't there that adds to that happiness. And I think about this one time when I was recording down in LA, and normally when we record music, we're spending 16, 18-hour days in the studio, just banging everything out, trying our best to make it all sound awesome. And we flew down to LA to record this tune with this producer, thinking it was going to be the same way, but it was just a totally different process. And we were done within about 4 or 5 hours. And it's kind of crazy. And we had to do a lot of work later. But normally what we would do after recording is we would go out and, celebrate. And I remember after we finished that, we're like, well, I guess we should go out to celebrate. But it just felt kind of empty because it felt like we hadn't actually earned the achievement. And so in a lot of the same ways, I know he kind of expands on this in just happiness and sadness and all this different stuff. And I don't know if you remember I can't remember the movie, but it's that Disney movie where everyone's got like feelings are personified within a person. And,
Inside Out.
Inside Out. Yeah. And that movie, it actually does a pretty good job of being like, hey, like sometimes happy memories contain a little sad moment, because it's almost like you can't understand happiness unless you also understand that there's a potential for unhappiness. Or at least the happy moments are made better by the fact that you realize that there is unhappiness, and maybe that's even the default state of the world. So I like this take, and it's pretty evergreen, which is awesome. I like people expanding upon it, but maybe that's why we're here.
He's always been very focused on the idea of happiness and how you can bring meaning to life, and that's now that he's not the president of AEI, he's doing even more sort of delving into these ideas. And I think he's trying to speak to, in some ways, in layman's terms, but I think a more accurate picture of this tweet would be for him to say, not your happiness requires unhappiness, but maybe your joy requires unhappiness, because
that's good.
The difference of having a life where you choose to be happy is joy. Happiness is a fleeting luck-based thing, hap being a root word of meaning sort of fleeting luck, a happenstance, it just happened. Happiness is kind of like that. Whereas joy is more of a state of being, a long-lasting, eternal thing. I think that happiness doesn't necessarily require unhappiness as a causal thing. Like, you don't need unhappiness to be happy in a moment, but you do need unhappiness in many ways to experience joy long-lasting, and then through that joy, experience happiness in other moments. So again, I agree. This is obviously just a tweet, so he is restricted in what he's saying. But I think that sort of fleshes out this idea a little bit more. And I think that we live in a world that constantly preaches everything is accessible to you, and there are problems that we can tackle and we can change, which is a good thing to motivate people to go out and make change and positive, differences and conquering problems. But I think in preaching those messages, sometimes we overlook the very reality that by the nature of life, there will be things that are going to come short, and you have to learn how to cope and deal. And because of those things, it will make the happy moments happier, and the the sweet moments sweeter. But our culture in many ways is impressing, especially upon young people, this profound unhappiness, because it's telling them, oh, this unhappiness doesn't need to exist. Like, you shouldn't have to live in a world where I mean, I'm thinking generally of progressive stuff.
Yeah.
Maybe this happens on the right too, but like, oh, you shouldn't have to live in a world where you have to pay for healthcare. It should be free. And that's just, like, yes, there are ways to improve healthcare. Yes, we should move towards a system that gives you more bang for the buck. But the reality is that, no matter what system you use, there are costs to healthcare, and that will require some level of pain along the process somewhere.
Yeah.
There's a trade-off in everything. There's an opportunity cost everywhere. And so I think even, extrapolating a little bit more from, going directly on happiness and unhappiness, I think that this is just a good pinpoint to say, everything has a cost. Like, you can get more for less. But there's always a cost to something, even if it's a better exchange, even if you're producing more than what you start with, there's always a cost. And I think that this kind of parallels that economic line of thinking with happiness, and they're very, very closely linked, because producing often involves toil. It often involves mourning or loss or learning or growing and all those things. And so I see them very, very similarly in my mind. And I love that this message comes out. And I think that people need to think about it and dwell on it and reflect it in all areas of life, because the culture is so bent on selling you something that says we can jump over the sad part, we can jump over the work and just get the free thing now. The only reason you don't have it is because of other people. And then you get profoundly unhappy because of that, because you're looking at the things that are out of your control and then blaming everything there and not doing anything to get your own happiness and overcome your unhappiness, because you'd rather wallow in this state of unhappiness because it's someone else's fault.
Yeah, I like what you're saying about it's not necessarily a matter of just unhappiness. It's a matter of trade-offs. And I mean, to grow up is to realize that to be something, you have to say no to most things.
Right.
And, Jordan Peterson has this analogy about Peter Pan, and it's like, yeah, Peter Pan is permanently a child because he wants to be a child of infinite potential. You could potentially be anything, but to, become an adult means that says, I am doing this. And to say you're doing that means you are not going to do something else. And I agree with you that, like, our culture a lot of times will say, like, well, no, you shouldn't be you shouldn't be unhappy. You shouldn't feel this sense of giving it up. You should always have the maximum amount of potential. You don't want to say no to anything. A lot of boomers told kids growing up that, like, hey, you could be anything you want to be, and things like that. And it's really good of Arthur Brooks to say that, like, it is normal to experience some level of unhappiness in some way, or to mourn loss, or to feel something that's bad. That's a normal part of life. And just because that's happening doesn't mean that there's something wrong. It's actually just base level reality. And it made me think about when I was proposing to my wife, in the interim between when I'd proposed to her and we were getting married, and we were kind of setting up our lives and planning what we were going to be doing, and where we were going to live and how this was all going to work, and like how the schedule was going to go and all these things. Like, I just realized, like, oh man, like, there is a part of me that is going to, for lack of a better term, die. Like, a lot of my independence, my ability to unilaterally on my own terms pursue dreams that I have, they are now subject to someone else's consideration and their needs and their wants and their preferences as well. They need to be involved in it. Our culture tells us throughout our entire lives that that's unhealthy, that mindset of giving that up for someone else is unhealthy and bad. And I've seen a lot of people that are not married, say no to really good relationships and really good marriages, and never even take the first step of that, because the self-sacrifice has been programmed into their mind as something that is unhealthy and bad. But the fact of the matter is that death is part of saying yes to something that is better than anything you could ever have on your own. I know you're happily married and I'm happily married, and, like, I wouldn't trade anything. Looking back on it, I'm so glad we got over those humps, and I got over those humps, because it was mainly my issue of dying to that independent self. Because what I've traded for is so much better. Like, it is so much better to be self-sacrificing and to live on behalf of something greater than just your own whims and dreams and desires, for something that is bigger than that. But it does feel like something is dying inside of you. It feels like an amputation of something. I think C.S. Lewis likens it to, setting a broken bone. Like, there's pain as the pieces align. It's just part of any sort of growing and doing that you need to have happen. So that's the part of this take that I really, really like, and it's a good take anyways, but is that it is normal to feel these things, and it's not a bad thing. It's not an unnatural thing. It's not even something that necessarily needs to be fixed. The process of feeling it is fixing it.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And everything you're saying applies also to, and maybe in some ways even more so, to child rearing and, bringing children into the world, because they are the epitome of selfishness. And in order to take care of them, you are doing everything of sacrificing. And so I'm sure you're looking forward to that pretty soon here coming up.
Yes.
And what this is going to relate to a take we're looking at later. So I won't go fully into it, but I think that if we don't have this kind of message being preached from Arthur Brooks as the default, as the normal, as people, hearing this message regularly, our culture will more and more slip into places where even when you're presented with perhaps one of the greatest joys a human can experience, their own offspring, they are still more prone to fall into the selfish pattern of regret and pattern of, I want my independence more than I care about this beautiful thing that I've created.
Yes.
And that's dangerous, because it's normal for parents to miss that independence. It's normal for parents to be like, this is really hard, but it's not normal for parents to think, I regret this. And that, I think, is a growing thing in a culture that is more and more self-obsessed and selfish. And so I think if we can push this message that Arthur Brooks is saying here, and if that can become the normal again, that would be a very healthy thing for our culture. Yeah. Particularly in the children department. But like I said, we'll get to that in a little bit.
Yes.
Okay, our next take comes from the comment section on Facebook on a Spike Cohen post. Spike is talking about the initial results of I believe it's the presidential election in Argentina. And to give some context, right now I've only ever read his name, so apologize for potential mispronunciation here, but Javier Milei he won the first initial round of voting. So there's more voting to be done in different rounds where different people will be eliminated. So he's not guaranteed to get it. But on the initial one, he was winning, which is pretty incredible, because he is a pretty hardcore libertarian ANCAP type individual who preached very boldly about eliminating basically all the government agencies he could, and was completely unapologetic in that. So Spike had posted about this, and then he comments on his own post with a sort of a little meme format where he says, "Libertarian strategists, we have to be careful not to be too bold in our messaging. It will scare off voters. Javier Milei, promising to eliminate most government agencies." And then it shows a picture of him like rocking out in front of a big flame screen in the background. And of course, he's doing well in the election. And then we have a comment that reads, "Dr. Jo Jorgensen was pretty bold in her messaging, and I found that to be exactly what was needed. Really wish we could ditch the broken two-party system we have." What do you think of that last comment there, Britt?
I can't tell if it's sarcastic or not because it's so bad.
I don't think it is.
It's a bad take for sure. Bold messaging is, it is what you say, but it's also the timing in which you say it. Things that were considered bold 40 years ago are no longer considered bold today. And Jo Jorgensen's messaging throughout her campaign was bold of, 10, 20, 30 years ago, when she should have been talking about things like the lockdowns and the overall government medical, pharmaceutical industrial complex tyranny. She was talking about it's not enough to be, anti-racist. We need to be actively anti-racist. And or not racist, anti, you know what I'm saying, the infamous tweet. So her messaging was catered towards, well, let's just get a bunch of votes. But what's hilarious, they pitched her as like, yeah, it was a successful campaign. She got the second most votes of any Libertarian Party candidate in the history of the Libertarian Party. And it's like, yeah, the first one was the election cycle beforehand. So it means that you could also put it as she's trended downwards from our peak, the first step of that. Right. So and the irony too is like, really wish we could ditch the broken two-party system we have. And it's like, yeah, her bold messaging was the bold messaging of the two parties for the most part, or at least it was bold messaging that didn't offend the bases of either two parties. So therefore, anyone that had any opinion outside of that, that you could create a coalition of that would would then break that, or at least have some influence on it, like they have nothing to go to. They're just like, well, basically Libertarian Party is Republican Party or Democrat Party light. And it's not anything that I would vote for. So I might as well just go vote for Trump or vote for someone that is actually going to make things entertaining. So yeah, Jo Jorgensen's campaign, I mean, I'm sure she's a nice lady and stuff, but it was not bold, and it was not game changing, and it did not, the results that they were looking for with all the votes or whatever didn't come about either. So overall, kind of a fail.
Oh yeah, I think the only context in which you could consider Jo Jorgensen's messaging bold is if you only had the reference point to compare it to of Gary Johnson and Bill Weld. Like,
Sure.
If that's your frame of reference, then oh yeah, she's bold.
That's fair.
But that's a terrible frame of reference. like okay, she didn't say that Hillary Clinton would be a respectable president. Cool. That's not the baseline for bold messaging. That's just an utter fail on like Bill Weld and Gary Johnson. You're completely right that the context matters. It's not even only the context that matters. It's also your actions and what you do after the fact, because bold messaging, it's one thing to say something radical, and it's another thing to embody and demonstrate that you're willing to do it. And I recognize that that's difficult when you aren't actually elected, right? But I would argue, for instance, Donald Trump had very bold messaging when it came to, say, immigration. It was popular in the Republican Party, but it wasn't politically correct. Did he deliver on it? No, he didn't build the wall. So was it really bold messaging in a good way? It was not really. And Jo Jorgensen obviously wasn't elected president, but look at Spike Cohen. Neither was he, and he's actually done things like created organizations that do voluntary work based on community needs. He's done work to help call out corrupt city councils, corrupt policemen, and he's doing the work to show that his messaging, he's putting the effort behind his messaging as well. And so to say Dr. Jo Jorgensen was pretty bold in her messaging, I don't think that's backed up by what she said or by what she's done since then. The only things I've even seen her message after the fact are usually after, I don't know, like the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire says something off color or out of taste, and then she condemns it or something, which, I'm not endorsing everything they've said either, but that's not bold messaging. And then the last part of, I wish we could ditch the broken two-party system we have. I mean, sure, but that's also kind of not bold messaging. Like, you're not that radical for saying, oh man, the two-party system sucks. Like, everyone will say that.
Even people a part of the two parties wish there was a third party.
Yes. Exactly. So, I mean, I always laughed when Michael Malice would highlight a lot of the messaging, I think, during the Jorgensen campaign was like, let her speak, and there's a third option and things like that. And he was laughing because he's like, okay, so now you're saying that you shouldn't vote for the lesser of two evils, you should vote for the lesser of three evils. Like, why is that so much better? And that's the level of, again, bold messaging she brought, which is really not that bold at all.
Yeah. I need to go find her Twitter or X profile, but she reminded me so much of, so this is her X profile. President at People for Liberty 2020, libertarian candidate, social scientist, entrepreneur, educator, parent, whiskey drinker, and hockey player. And it just reminded me of like the way that like the Democrat establishment told, some PR person told Elizabeth Warren, hey, you need to like say like, I could have a beer with that person. Like when she said whiskey drinker, like, well, what's the libertarian version of being a beer drinker? It's to be a whiskey drinker and to play hockey. And it's like, you look at Jo Jorgensen and her messaging, and it's like, whiskey drinker and hockey player is supposed to convey like, oh, you're tough. You kind of like say things out of turn. You say things that everyone's thinking, but no one actually has the courage to say. But like, she did the exact opposite of that. And she was always like, like she was on that Patrick Bet David podcast talking about Dave Smith, and she was like, well, what do you? He asked him like, what do you think about Dave Smith? And she said a bunch of things that obviously her PR people told her to say. Like, oh, if you have 12 drinks, you can go do whatever you want with a woman, which Dave Smith did not say in that way. And then Patrick Bet David called her on it, and she had no answer for it. So it's just like, yeah, you're a cardboard cutout in some ways, like in the same way that Elizabeth Warren is not someone that could go enjoy a beer with a blue collar worker. Like, I don't think that Jo Jorgensen, maybe she is, but to me, and from a perception standpoint, is not someone that I could go enjoy a glass of whiskey with or play hockey with or anything like that. And it just reeks of the same, like, let's craft an image type of deal. And that's if you have the same type of PR as the two-party system, you have more or less the same talking points, you run your campaign the same way, and your goal, which is to get as many votes, is the same as the two-party system, then why do we need a third party? Just go join one of the other two parties. That's not the whole point of the Libertarian Party. The point of the Libertarian Party is to wake people up to liberty.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say is bold messaging doesn't have to be in everything I agree with. You know, RFK Jr. has pretty bold messaging in a lot of areas that not all of which I agree with. Bernie Sanders, in particular in 2016, had bold messaging, a lot of which I didn't agree with. He pushed the Overton window, not single-handedly, but in large part due to him. For the left, he was the leader that made a lot of these things that were previously unpalatable to have in the mainstream ideas. He made those mainstream. I mean, think about Joe Biden, talking about the most socialized ideas ever. Whether or not he enacts them, whether or not he believes in them, he had to pretend to adopt those ideas because Bernie had been pushing so far left in his messaging in many areas. So I mean, I think that some people like AOC and even Bernie to some degree have fallen off from that a little bit, and now they play it way safe because they've pushed the Overton window. But there are people who I profoundly disagree with who have bold messaging, and frankly, I respect those people more when they have bold messaging than, say, your Mike Pence's or your Kamala Harris's, who really they're not bold in their messaging. They're teleprompted, they're predictable, they are, what am I approved to say here based on the polling results of this issue. And so that's probably also what attracted a lot of people to Trump, even if I don't think he lived up to a lot of his bold speech. Okay. Here is a Twitter post. I'm gonna keep calling it Twitter. I'm sorry, I can't do X. Not until you'll have to pry it from my cold dead hand.
Twitter. That's how strong the branding is. Even after it was killed, it still exists on.
Exactly. People regret having abortions. People regret having children. People don't regret their abortion. People don't regret their children. For every person, there's another who is the opposite. It doesn't mean we should control any of it. What do you think there, Britt?
It's a terrible take. Donnie, Don, if you went on a murder spree, and you woke up because you had a psychotic break, you'd regret it. Ted Bundy probably wouldn't regret it initially. I mean, I know he did later in life. And that's like what this is saying. It's like, oh, well, some people regret murdering people and others that are psychopaths and that enjoy it don't. It's like the issue with abortion that people are making against it is not that, oh, like you might regret it later or something like that. It's that it's a moral wrong regardless of whether or not you regret it. It's not an issue of like choice, and as much as I should have the choice to murder someone. This kind of struck me as when I saw it, it's such a weird and obviously bad take, but they still make this type of argument. And what's scary about this type of argument is that it's kind of evergreen in that it can be taken incredibly far. People regret infanticide. Other people don't regret infanticide. People regret, killing, an adult that has a broken arm, and other people don't regret it. It's like, you can make this argument for any level of moral decision that you're making, because it kind of removes the moral element from it, and it just boils it down to choice. It's like, no, choice and liberty are not the ultimate deciders of whether something is right or wrong. There's actually a higher principle than liberty that governs it. And in the secular world, from our standpoint, at least, we're not secular, but from like an anarchist standpoint, a secular argument for it is that non-aggression, like you should not aggress upon another person. That's the ultimate way to decide whether liberty, like the bounds of where your liberty extends. These people clearly don't have that type of principle, so they'll use any argument they can to justify their own selfish actions.
Yeah, this is a complete misconstruing of an argument that some pro-life people will make. So the way that I kind of see the narrative play out is women who are trying to, in the pro-choice position, will say, think about all of the regret you will face when you have this baby, when you miss out on that career, when you miss out on your independence, et cetera, et cetera. And the response to that is, like they might try to sell you on that, but actually lots of women end up regretting their abortions. It's not a matter of you're only ever going to regret not getting an abortion because of your independence. There are many women who suffer deeply from the trauma of having this. And so, that's not the pro-life position. It's not the pro-life, prerogative to put that forward to say, here's why you shouldn't have an abortion, because many people regret it. That's just one of the side effects that, again, is usually used to answer back you're only ever going to regret not getting an abortion, which they'd say, one, that's not right, but two, many women do regret this abortion. And it's horrible. So this person sees that argument, takes it as like the primary motivation, and then says, well, guess what? Some people regret it, some people don't. So that doesn't mean we should control everyone. And that doesn't, one, that's not where the argument basis starts from. So it's an incomplete response to any of the arguments the pro-life position puts forth. But secondarily, as you pointed out, it's a terrible ethical framework to operate on. Regret is not the basis by which we judge a moral right or wrong. That just seems like if you do judge the right and wrongs based on regret, one, you'd have to follow a very weird, naturalistic, only natural law written on your hearts kind of ethics. But then you'd also have to take into account every single individual committing every single action to know whether or not something is right, wrong, or right. Because as long as there is a potential for someone to do something they haven't done, you will never know if they regret it or not. Which is just, again, a complete absurd level to determine whether or not something's right or wrong. And then if you say, well, we don't need every person, we just need a majority, then you get into utilitarian ethics, which is also wrong to say, okay, so now it's only if most people regret this thing, is it wrong? Again, it's not a coherent way to actually judge the right or wrong of something. So this post is not only incoherent from an ethical standpoint, it's also incoherent from the basis, because it's not tackling the core issue or the pro-life arguments.
Yeah. I don't have any more to add to. That was great.
Okay, well, I guess the last thing I will say is, again, it's very disturbing to read someone say people regret having children. I know it's true, but that also should not be normalized. Like to me, there is a value in a society that does have stigmas against things. I'm not saying we have thought police, make it illegal to regret having children, but there should be a very heavy stigma against regretting something like that. You should, if you feel regret, you should reevaluate. You should think, oh, wow, what I'm thinking right now is shameful, and I should regret and reorient myself and figure out what's wrong with me and uproot that selfishness. Yeah. And so I think that you can't just, put that line in there and normalize that either. I think that there is benefit to stigmatizing that thought, stigmatize selfishness culturally, and say, there may be people who regret children. They should never regret having children. Children are the biggest joy, the most unique produce you can create as a human, and every single child is a miracle. And so if you regret having that, you need to reevaluate yourself, and that's not okay. Just because you have regret doesn't mean you should have regret. Okay, we'll move to our next post. Unpopular opinion. Student loans should be at 0% interest. Mortgages on primary residence should be under or equal to 3%, and second homes have premium interest rates and taxes. People trying to achieve the American dream shouldn't be struggling, and if you own multiple homes, you're making it harder for everyone else. All right, is that an unpopular opinion?
This I mean, it's actually a really popular opinion, but just because it's popular doesn't mean it's a good take. It's a terribly bad take. This person just like arbitrarily decides what they think the interest rate should be at. Mortgages on a primary residence should be 3%. And it's like, that's the lowest they've ever been in the history of since homes and the Federal Reserve and these things have been instituted. So it's like, it's kind of like saying like, there's a discount on candy bars down to 1 cent because they got to move all the inventory. It's like, I think that all candy bars should be 1 cent because that's what it's at. It's just like, there's no logic behind why she thinks it should be 3%, and so follows, why second home should have premium interest rates and taxes. She doesn't even mention those anyways. But the part that I really take issue with is that people are trying to achieve the American dream. They shouldn't be struggling. If you own multiple homes, you're making it harder for everyone else. And I see this type of argument be made towards landlords quite often. So one of our mutual friends and I were talking about this, and he owns several houses down south. He rents them out, and he rents them out by the room to different tenants, and they're really close to one of the university campuses down there. And it's like $800 a room, and there's a lot of people living in the house, but they all get all their internet, utilities, house cleaning, all that stuff's included, which is awesome. And people will say things like, oh yeah, like you guys are driving up the housing prices, in the area, or you're buying so many houses that normal families can't own a home. But the thing is that there are 8 people that if they wanted to be within 10 minutes of this university campus, they wanted to be able to have walkability. They want to be close to all these areas and stuff and shopping. They can't do that for $800. They could only do that by buying a really expensive home on their own. They would have to move out of the city. They'd have to probably move about an hour, hour and a half away from where they want to commute to in order to find something at that price point. So the fact of the matter is that by this guy owning this house and making it available to them, using the capital that he has worked for and accumulated, he has now made it possible for 8 people to live in the area close to where they want to be. And they've decided that's worth the trade-off of $800 to live in a room close to where they want to be. So the argument goes both ways, right? You could say that people that are homeowners are making it harder for people that just want to live and work, want to live where they work and go to school. They're driving up the rental prices, making it so hard for them that they're unable to do that. But that's what the free market is able to do, is that people use trade-offs, and they use the trade-offs with the calculus of interest rates to make the proper investment and the proper decisions. When you artificially set an interest rate at 3% or 10% or 50% or whatever it's going to be, suddenly now the market can't adjust, and it has to adjust to only that baseline level that you've determined. And that creates weird scenarios, like where housing prices in the Seattle area go up, an average of 14 to 15% every year because of the low interest rates. And then combine that with the macroeconomic environment and investment and the type of people that live here. It just skews everything in a way that is unnatural. It's kind of like when you have an imbalance in the way that your muscles on your body have developed. It's like one thing, I'm dealing with a leg injury right now. Like, I now walk a little bit differently, and I've been walking differently for the past 2 weeks. And there are certain muscles on my body that are now more sore. And once I get this thing repaired in my knee, I'm going to have to go to physical therapy to re-strengthen the muscles that were not used because of the weakness. My body compensated for the unnatural problem that occurred. The only way to get back to, even is for me to do natural things. And natural things is just to let the market and banks set the interest rates based on what type of investment they think is coming down the pipe. People who get it right will be rewarded, and people who get it wrong will be punished. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely right. I laugh at the idea that student loans should be 0% as well, since you kind of tackled the housing aspect of this. Student loans being 0%. I mean, at that point, all this basically would be it's just socialism with more steps kind of a thing, because when you're charging 0% interest, you are giving money in a sense, right? Because we've talked about this pretty recently before, but the idea of interest is just like interest, or in order to have capital, in order to have something of value in the immediate moment, is more valuable than to have it the same amount in 5 days. Because when you have it now, you can use that. So whether that's, having a hammer, and you can start building something that then you have earlier and you can use to protect yourself, to get more things, to whatever it is, or whether that's money and you can invest that money into projects and into getting yourself something nice, or whatever it is, sooner is worth more than later. And that's what interest seeks to track and measure. And so when you're talking about student loans being 0% interest, all you're basically saying is, I basically want the government to give away money for free. And here's the thing. 0% interest on a loan is creating an arbitrary false incentive for people to do things and sort of social engineer. And we're worried now about, oh man, there's all these people who get qualified degrees, but then they can't seem to actually get a real job. And it's like, well, yeah, because we've devalued already, even with, interest rates as they currently are low for student loans and things like that. We've already created such a demand for them that, an employer looks, and now there's like, you've sort of created inflation in degrees. And why do we have inflation in degrees? Well, because more people have been told you should go to college, you should go to school than necessarily ought to. In the same way that the market balances itself out through interest in housing and what's valuable there or not, interest rates can set that level of interest as well for whether or not you should take a student loan. If you're thinking, man, I probably won't be able to make this pay off for me at the rate of this interest, then I should, then I should probably not go to college, and then you can do something that's actually more productive with your time and better for everyone involved. If the interest loan rate is 0%, then no one has any incentive to pay you back on time. Everyone has incentive to take that money, and there's no mechanism for rebuilding the money that's been lent out. And that, of course, even bypasses the idea of the government being in control, basically, of these lenders, even though they're technically private. There's kind of a sick private public partnership that means taxpayers would be on the hook for any lost revenue from a 0% student loan.
Exactly. And we just take it like the interest rate, when we say the Fed funds rate, like we think of it as, oh, this is like a global state of how things are being loaned, but it's tied to like a mechanism, which is that banks can now decide, hey, I have a floor at which I can loan money and not be punished for it. Because in a traditional banking system, like a bank wants to try and keep enough cash on hand that they can satisfy, withdrawals from the people who've deposited stuff into their bank. And to do that, like they might have to, if they make a bad loan or something like that and they can't collect on it, it's going to be a really awful thing, because that means they might not be able to fulfill their depositors' withdrawals. The existence of the Federal Reserve and the Fed funds rate means that banks have almost an unlimited supply of money they can technically borrow to satisfy that. And when I say unlimited, it's as difficult as them entering a couple zeros on a keyboard to get that money printed and into their bank account. And so that type of incentive means that they have all the incentive in the world to make loans to students, or make loans to people that have mortgages. And then the government also has incentives to make student loans because they can just print more money. That Fed funds rate not only represents like the current rate at which you can borrow or transfer money, but it's also signatory of an unlimited hypothetical pot of money exists that we can draw from. If let's just say independent banks were the only ones making student loans and they had no safety net from the federal government to fall back on if something went bad, there's no way they would ever do 0% interest. They might not even do whatever the current interest rate is for student loans. They would actually be more interested in what kind of degree you're getting. Like if you think about an 18-year-old going to a bank and saying, hey, I've been working with my dad as an electrician apprentice, for the past 4 years. I know this, and that, and I actually have a bunch of jobs lined up, and I anticipate I'll be able to do $800,000 in revenue in the next year. No bank is going to loan that 18-year-old enough money to buy an electrical van and tools. They're just not going to do it. You have no credit history, nothing. It's too much of a risk to them. Yet if a 18-year-old goes and says, hey, I want to get a college degree, the bank doesn't even think like about whether or not this is going to be a degree that they can pay, that will provide them enough revenue to pay them back. If banks were independent, private, and didn't have that infinite money to draw from, like they would be much more interested in making those loans. And just like you're saying, if you drop the student loan rate to 0%, it's actually going to exacerbate the problem. There's going to be more and more degrees that are out there that are worthless, that don't actually produce what they've been loaned. They won't be able to pay it back. And we're going to just continually find ourselves in this issue. You need to have a market feedback for people. And it sucks for people that got these loans. I feel really bad for them. I mean, they at 18, sometimes some of them not even 18 yet. Some of them still technically a minor from a legal standpoint, are being given these loans, accepted to colleges, and promised the world, basically. And it's like, yeah, sign your life away at no chance of bankruptcy, getting rid of it, for $200,000, $300,000 that lives with you for the rest of your life. That I would feel taken advantage of as well. But the fact of the matter is that is the punishment for degrees that are not worth it. There is no feedback mechanism, though, for these people if we make loans at 0% or if we totally forgive student loans. Like that punishment and that discomfort needs to occur in order for the market to correct itself. And the longer we delay that punishment and requirements, the harder it's going to get and the more painful it will be. And the more people who did not deserve to suffer will continue to suffer.
Just as a last sort of, like what is this really like? Think about it this way. Imagine you're on our favorite place, Coconut Island, and you are stranded and you decide you really need to get some food. And there's only, there's like 50 people on this island, but there's only 10 ladders. If there's no mechanism by which you prioritize who should be getting those ladders, well, then you could be giving those ladders to people who will collect coconuts all day and people who will take those ladders and start climbing up trees that don't have any coconuts because they think they're very interesting to learn about. And, obviously we're in a society much more developed than that. People can expand what they do or don't have. There's all kinds of, opportunities, and we're not in a base survival instinct. So there's more room and flexibility, but the premise is the same. Interest functions as a tool to help you discern whether or not you are going to be using that money wisely or not. And if you're if you're providing these funds to someone who's not going to be producing things and they're just going to be climbing up a tree that doesn't have anything fruitful on it, then that money essentially has gone wasted, and that time that has been lost ends up costing people on the whole island.
That's a great analogy. Barking up the wrong tree.
Yeah, exactly.
Wrong coconut tree.
All right. Our last take here comes from Austin Peterson. Austin tweets, "The USA should mostly stay out of foreign affairs, including Ukraine and Russia, but we probably need to defend Taiwan." What do you think?
It's a bad take. I mean, I know you and I are both big AP for Liberty fans, but this is... I would ask him, and I'd be curious to know, like, what is different about Taiwan versus Ukraine and Russia? And the only thing that I can think of that he would probably say is that, like, well, Taiwan is a great, huge producer, of semiconductors and all these chips and silicon and all these things that we need. I've worked at companies and I've had companies that a lot of our manufacturing base was in Taiwan. And so it was kind of like a key element of our distribution center to be able to function, is for them to be independent. But I don't know. It's kind of a weirdly short-sighted take if that's the best argument you've got for why we need to defend Taiwan, because one, I mean, we're already doing investment over here. There are a lot of companies trying to spin up factories to build silicon chips and semiconductors and all these different things that are important for electronics in the United States. Like, it's an incredible investment opportunity because of this risk. What we should be doing in the United States is deregulating that, so that way we can actually stand alone without having to use Taiwan. And then the other aspect of it is, like, okay, if we defend Taiwan, can we defend Taiwan?
Yeah.
I don't think we can. People don't understand, like, the logistics of moving enough people to fight on someone else's doorstep, because Taiwan is literally on China's doorstep, moving all of our people over there before China can overwhelm Taiwan. And it's like, so what, we're going to declare war on China to defend Taiwan, and the war is already over, or at least the battle for Taiwan is already over by the time we get there. And so they nuke the United States and we nuke them, and then they nuke someplace else and we nuke someplace else, and millions and billions of people dead, and China still has Taiwan at the end of all of it. So it's like, principally, I don't think it's good. I think it also, it makes it so people don't want to invest in things that we do need over here. And then practically, I just don't think we can actually defend Taiwan. We could fund them, I guess, but, like, I mean, how is that working in Ukraine? It's like the best we get is a standoff where people just continue to die and everything continues to become more destabilized. And, we've got threats we're threatened with one of the only nuclear powers in the world that, they're becoming a little bit more and more unstable. Like, everything just seems bad in that instance. So I just think practically it's not even something that's an option.
Yeah, it's funny because I feel like the ways to, I guess there's technically nuance. You could pull a I didn't actually say we needed to militarily intervene, kind of like haha gotcha moment, but clearly the implication is militarily defend Taiwan. And I think, I don't know that it's 100% in line with everything we would think, but I think, like, the answer to this is much better coming out of someone like Vivek Ramaswamy, whose whole point is that if we're talking about the problem with Taiwan, the way that you need to sort of de-escalate the whole situation is you talk about making a deal with Russia, where Russia backs out of Ukraine in exchange for Ukraine never being in NATO. You guarantee Ukraine will not join NATO, but then you also break the Russian Chinese alliance economically, because if you have if you have them paired up, then China will feel much more empowered to go into Taiwan. And the whole idea is we need to, you know, show that as a power in the West, our only response isn't going to be military, and that we actually have more like negotiating savvy to say that, look, it's actually worth it for you to not militarily invade this place, because we will make concessions where we need to through trade, through exchange. And I don't think that, I think that if you take away Russia and China's trade relationship to some degree, or at least you make it so that they're less exclusive partners, then the US becomes more valuable as a trade partner with China. I think you need to stop the discussion about, oh, we need to put tariffs on everything coming from China, and we need to stop demonizing the idea of doing business with China. And, sure, we can build up our own manufacturing if it makes sense, but I think that when you start talking in hostile terms in trade relations with China, well, then they're thinking, okay, well, if the US doesn't want to be a trade partner, well, then shoot, why don't we just take over Taiwan? That cripples them, as far as trade goes, and they'd have to commit to a land and oversee air war. They'd have to commit to a lot, which they don't necessarily want to do. And, between the US and China, I think China's probably much more willing and ready to go to war over that region. And so right now it's like, if the US is trying to ramp things up and say that we need to defend Taiwan, well, then the less the less likely of the two to actually want to go to war is saying, all right, we'll go to war. Then you're going to end up with this conflict. I think you need to find creative, and I don't know that Ramaswamy's idea will necessarily work, but I think that that's the much better pathway to looking into, which is use trade, use exchange, use negotiations, rather than jumping immediately to, oh, well, we need to defend Taiwan. And the thing is, I think that the last thing I'll say, I think that Austin's point here about we probably should stay out of foreign affairs, including Ukraine and Russia, seems like the least coherent of all of the perspectives, because I think that a lot of war hawks will say, if we back up Ukraine and we show China that we're willing to defend, then they will be less likely to go to Taiwan, knowing that we will go in full resistance. But Austin's position here is that we shouldn't be involved in Ukraine, but we should be involved in Taiwan, and somehow that if we back out of Ukraine, we're willing to go to a massive war over Taiwan. That seems a little bit less coherent. I get that when he's talking about priorities. Taiwan is a higher priority when it comes to trade and chipsets and things like that. Sure. But as it currently stands, I don't know that arguing for we should back out of Ukraine, but we should go full into Taiwan is very coherent.
Yeah, I have this phrase with like my band guys that like, you can be right or you can be real. And it was kind of a play on one of my mentors about like, you could be right or you can be rich when it came to business. And a lot of times it's like, yeah, should Taiwan be free? Like, yes, that's correct. That's right. What's the reality of the situation? Like, they have to be able to stand on their own. They are on the other side of the world and we cannot defend them. It's just not going to work out. So the reality of the situation is that like, are we going to just make it the whole thing worse by going over there and risking nuclear war and deaths of millions, and we still get the same consequence that we were trying to defend, in the first place? Or should we be pivoting and thinking, because it's kind of like you get like solution tunnel vision, which is like, well, this is the only way to solve it, and like all other options are now off the table, or they're not in our purview and vision. That's like, no, like the real risks of Taiwan being taken is that there are certain really critical trade routes and manufacturing that we won't be able to have anymore. It's like, well, maybe the way we solve that then is we just build that stuff over here. And that's not to say that it isn't right for Taiwan to want to be independent and to be able to defend itself against China. It's just a matter of reality of like, can we actually do that? And it's like, no, we can't. So maybe Taiwan needs to be looking to different options. But because we're giving all of this rhetoric that we can, like they also have tunnel vision that like, well, it's only the USA or die, in terms of what their solution is. So no one is helped. Clarity is such an important thing when deciding any decision. Like you want to make sure that you've eliminated all, peripheral ideas that your brain has subconsciously taken out of the equation. But if you are committed to some dogma, like you're not able to consider those things. You're not even able to be aware of them. And that's how devastating consequences and really bad decisions are made.
Absolutely. I think that's well put, and I don't think I've got any more.
All right.
So thanks so much for tuning into this week's episode. Again, if you've got any suggestions for us or feedback on how we did on these takes, whether you agree or disagree, let us know in the comments, and we'll catch you on the next one.